Hey there guys, Dr. Spin. I am pulling an album way out of the archives here because last year I was listening to Genesis's Duke. Like I usually do once about every 4 or 5 years. I kind of delve into that album. It's one that I never get tired of. And I wrote a pretty good post on that one that I still stick by. I'm pretty proud of how that one turned out. But after I got through with that one, I decided to kind of take a step forward in the catalog and revisit an album that I hadn't listened to in quite a while. And that's Genesis's Abacab. Abacab was a follow-up to Duke, and it's an album that, in the big picture of things, I kind of have given a hard time to in my mind. Duke for me is one of Genesis's finest albums, whether you're talking about the Peter Gabriel era or the Phil Collins era. I will argue it's worth with quite a bit of enthusiasm. I think that's probably their last really, really great album. So coming on the heels of that, Abacab is kind of a weird, scattered collection of songs in comparison. It's certainly not as cohesive as Duke is. Although it's one of the earliest introductions that I did have with Genesis. I remember, having a cable box like this one. You'd have to scroll back and forth, and on channel 20, that was MTV, and every now and then I would turn on that channel and this would show up. So I remember really liking that video. I really thought it was great to watch Phil Collins sing and play drums, which is always how I envisioned him, even though he didn't actually do that on stage very often. I always, in my mind, whenever the band plays, I see him singing and playing drums at the same time. It's got a really great driving beat, even though it's very simplistic. It's got a lot of drive to it. And it's got these great riffs that kind of fit together in this neat little puzzle. And the song itself is kind of nonsensical, but it's catchy, and it's got this great sort of aggressive bridge. So that was one of my first impressions of Genesis. I didn't really get into Genesis. I didn't buy their albums until like Invisible Touch, and so I started kind of getting into their catalog in a very backward way, like a lot of people actually. In the 80s, a lot of progressive rock bands were sort of trying to revamp themselves to make sense in the age of MTV, and this is definitely where Genesis fell. Genesis is very divisive amongst progressive rock fans because, well, if you're a progressive rock fan, then you can see their sort of movement towards a more accessible, pop-oriented sound as selling out. On the other hand, if you're a fan of pop music, a fan of songwriting and melodic songs, then you can see them as sort of shedding a lot of the stuff that they've done, the extra stuff, the extemporaneous, high-minded work that they were doing in the past, and kind of getting down to the essence of what they were about. So both views are ultimately true, right? And this is how they were dealing with coming into being in the 80s, is kind of trying to intentionally peeling away the things that they were associated with when they were a pioneering progressive rock band underneath, whenever Peter Gabriel was their lead singer. And divisive as they are, there's probably no member of the group that's more divisive than Phil Collins. Phil Collins came on as the lead singer in around 1974, and that was really shortly thereafter when they really started kind of making movements towards becoming a pop band. It wasn't like an overnight thing. You can see on their albums, they were like, and then they were three, and Duke to a degree had a lot of progressive rock characteristics, but it had these little pop songs sprinkled in there. Well, that's shifted when we get to Abacab. Abacab is whenever we start having several pop songs with a few prog songs starting to pop up in there. And that continued throughout the rest of their career. They would have more and more pop songs with like a kind of a bone thrown to their old progressive rock fan base, just to let them know they could still kind of do it, right? But Abacab is a kind of a weird beast because it's a pop album, but most of the songs are of that length. But there are some of them that are sort of well, they seem obtuse in the beginning. They seem sort of inaccessible. But really what they are is kind of complicated tunes that they've sort of boiled down to a shorter framework. They're trying to play progressive rock music, but in a much shorter format. There's Me and Sarah Jane. There's Keep It Dark. There's Dodo/Lurker. Those are all songs that back in the day, whenever I was kind of listening to this album, especially in a relationship to Duke, seemed just kind of unremarkable, kind of forgettable. Because it wasn't that they're not really great pop songs, and they're sort of like coming away from progressive rock. They're sort of like little progressive rock mini songs, and as such, they kind of don't stick to the rib as much as some of the other more well thought out songs in the album. But as I've gone back and listened to them and become more familiar with them, I think there's a lot of really ingenious things that are happening on those songs. And Dodo Lurker is great. It's got that awesome keyboard sound at the beginning. Great, super energetic and powerful. And that particular song harkens back a little bit more to the kind of surrealist storytelling that Peter Gabriel was known for with the group. So it kind of fits within the Genesis paradigm. But it's just, it doesn't, since Abacab is neither one thing or the other, it's neither a pop album nor a progressive rock album. Those songs are kind of hard to categorize, to understand, until you understand how this album is sort of that axis upon which Genesis went from being a progressive rock band and started becoming more of a pop band. There are some experiments on Abacab that just flat out don't work. Okay, even whenever I was younger, the song "Who Done It" was a big standout dud. It's like a blemish on the album overall, and it's sort of a joke. I think that Phil Collins and the band was trying to play, but it's a joke that kind of falls flat. And not only did they have this kind of nonsensical noise song where they're trying to make fun of poorly put together music, they even played it live for a little while. Now, hold on to your seats for this one, folks, because this is painful to watch. Okay, so it's time for us to talk about a new segment, and I think that going forward we should always kind of keep this in mind. This is how I see things in terms of good Phil, bad Phil. How can a guy like Phil Collins, who was such a great progressive rock drummer with such a distinctive style and with such a great melodic sense, be able to make things like, albums like Duke, which are so heartfelt and so emotionally and musically satisfying, and then a few years later release some nonsense like Billy Don't Lose My Number, like so painfully pandering to the audience? How can those two different kinds of Phil Collins exist? And the answer is they do. I mean, Phil Collins wrote some really amazing musical work, and he wrote some real junk. And these two things can coexist. As a matter of fact, they can coexist in the same song. And the one that really stands out to me on Abacab that shows this dichotomy of what Phil Collins is about is No Reply at All. No Reply at All is the second track on Abacab. And it's a really great song. There's so much about it that I like. First of all, Mike Rutherford's bass playing on the album is phenomenal. But if you can key into what he's doing on No Reply at All, it's some fantastic bass playing. He's completely underrated as a bass player. And you have the tune itself is catchy, and it's got a great bridge, like a lot of songs on Abacab does. But there's also the inclusion of the brass on the song. And my understanding, if you read around, is Phil Collins had suggested that the band, try out putting, the Earth, Wind, and Fire horns on No Reply at All. It worked on his solo album, so he called him in and they did it. But it's just incongruous to the Genesis sound to me. It's like that sounds more like what would, as Phil Collins as a soloist would do. And it just doesn't, for me personally, it distracts from what the guys in Genesis are doing. The horn line is basically doubling Mike Rutherford's bass playing. In some ways it kind of distracts, I think, from the amazing work that he's doing on the bass. I almost would rather not hear the brass and just hear him playing bass on it. It would be, to me, more compelling. So, and then you watch the video for it, and this is where the breakdown happens.
But there's no reply at all. Dance with me. You never dance with me. Ooh, it seems that I can move. I'm close to you, close as I can get. Yeah, there's no reply at all. There's no reply at all. I get the feeling you're trying to tell me. Is there something that I should know? What excuse are you trying to sell me? Should I be reading stop or go? I don't know.
On the one hand, you see them playing together. And on the next hand, you see them sort of filling in for the Earth, Wind, and Fire horns with, sunglasses and acting silly. And that those two things are on the album, on that song by themselves. They coexist in that song. And this, for me, is an example of like Good Phil, where they're playing like this amazing music and there's this heartfelt, charismatic energy to it. And then like the goofy horns. And that's hard to take in. Every time I listen to that song, I have to travel through the distance of like, oh, here comes the horns. And then by the time I'm done, like, man, that's a great song. I like it. But that's the thing. Is Phil Collins is kind of putting these things in there, and the band was agreeing to it. Now I'm blaming this on Phil Collins, but it's not just his fault. The other guys in the band were going this direction too, and so it was a group effort. But this is to me an example of how good Phil and bad Phil are. They can coexist in one instance and he can be great one second and be totally cheesy the next moment. One of the best songs, one of my favorite songs on Abacab, is the song "Man in the Corner." "Man in the Corner" is a song that Phil Collins did write for Genesis. It was mostly a Phil Collins track. And it is, to a degree, a little bit, you can tell he's trying to sort of do a recreation of what happened with In the Air Tonight. It's got a little bit of that same feel to it. But, man, it's really, his performance on it is really heartfelt. And the way that the chords and the lyrics interact with one another are very thoughtful. He'll sing like "There's no hiding place," and he'll duck down to that minor chord. And it feels like he's hiding,
Where he leads, no one will go. Oh, he's the lonely man there on the corner. What he's waiting for, I don't know. But he waits every day now. He's just waiting for something to show. Oh, nobody knows him. And nobody cares, 'cause there's no hiding place. There's no hiding place for you and me. Are we just like all the rest? We're looking too hard for something is gone, or moving too far to rest.
That sort of awareness of the relationship between the music and the lyrics makes that song, really push that song to me over and above a lot of the songs on that album. of which there are many great songs. I'm a big fan of the song Like It or Not, and that's one I guess that they didn't play very much live. There's virtually no footage of them playing it, but I love the guitar melody in it. I love Phil Collins' vocal performance at the end of it is extremely emotional. So there's many high points in Abacab that I think are great, that actually buoy the album as a whole to make it a great album. There are some low points. So if you get the album and you're like, Dr. Spin, how could you possibly have steered me this way with Who Done It sitting there? Well, I accept that Who Done It's on there, and I have to kind of swallow my pride on that one and say that's kind of a dud. But overall, Abacab is a much better album than I gave it credit for in the past. And certainly by far, some people would say it's a low point in the catalog. I don't think it's even close to the lowest point in Genesis' catalog. So I would suggest the album and checking it out if you are interested at all. It certainly is an important piece of Genesis history, and worth checking out, I think, in the end. So that's what I got for you guys today. I really appreciate you spending the time with me, and I will talk to you soon on the flip side.
God, I'm bored. Might as well be listening to Genesis.